The morning sun cast long shadows across Maple Street as 73-year-old Betty Johnson knelt beside her beloved rose garden. Her weathered hands moved carefully among the thorny stems, snipping away dead blooms with the precision that came from 30 years of practice. The roses were her pride and joy. Deep red American beauties stood tall next to delicate pink tea roses, while yellow climbers wound their way up the white picket fence that bordered her modest two-story home. Betty had lived on this quiet street since 1993, when she and her late husband Robert had saved every penny to buy their dream house. Back then, the neighborhood was more diverse, filled with families of all backgrounds who looked out for each other. Over the years, things had changed. The old families moved away and new ones moved in. Houses were renovated and expanded. Property values soared. Betty often felt like one of the last original residents left, but this was her home, and she wasn't going anywhere. She hummed softly to herself as she worked, the same gospel hymn her mother used to sing while hanging laundry on the line back in Alabama. The melody carried her back to simpler times, when a woman could tend her garden without a care in the world. Her arthritic fingers worked slowly but surely, each movement deliberate and purposeful. Gardening was her therapy, her connection to the earth and to memories of Robert, who had helped her plant these very roses 2 decades ago. The mailman's truck rumbled to a stop at the corner, and Betty glanced at her watch. Right on time, as always. She dusted the soil from her gardening gloves and stood up, her knees protesting the movement. Walking to the mailbox meant crossing her small front yard and stepping onto the sidewalk, something she did every day without thinking. Today felt no different. As she reached the mailbox and began sorting through the usual collection of bills and advertisements, Betty heard the low rumble of a car engine slowing down behind her. She turned to see a black and white police cruiser pulling up to the curb. 2 officers sat inside, both young men wearing dark sunglasses despite the early morning hour. The driver rolled down his window and stared at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Morning. Officers?" Betty said politely, the way her mother had taught her to always greet authority figures with respect. She tucked the mail under her arm and took a small step back toward her yard. The driver's door opened, and a tall, broad-shouldered officer stepped out. His partner, slightly shorter but equally intimidating, emerged from the passenger side. Both men approached her with slow, measured steps, their hands resting casually on their utility belts. "Ma'am, we received a call about suspicious activity in this area," the taller officer said, his voice stern and official. "Someone reported seeing a person acting strangely around these houses." Betty felt a flutter of confusion in her chest. "Suspicious activity? I'm sorry, officer, but I'm just getting my mail. I live right here." She gestured toward her house, where her garden tools lay scattered on the front porch and her watering can sat beside the steps. The second officer stepped closer, his eyes scanning her from head to toe. "You live here?" he asked, skepticism evident in his tone. "This is a pretty expensive neighborhood. Are you sure you're not just visiting someone?" The question hit Betty like a physical blow. She had been asked many things in her 73 years, but never whether she belonged in her own neighborhood. "Yes, I'm quite sure," she replied, her voice steady despite the growing unease in her stomach. "I've lived at 1247 Maple Street for 30 years. This is my home." The taller officer exchanged a glance with his partner. "Do you have any identification that proves you live here?" Betty shifted the mail in her hands, feeling suddenly exposed standing there in her gardening clothes with dirt under her fingernails. "Well, I wasn't planning on needing identification to get my mail from my own mailbox," she said, trying to keep her tone light. "My purse is inside the house." "Inside the house," the shorter officer repeated as if he didn't believe her. "Ma'am, we're going to need to see some identification before we can let you go." "Let her go?" Betty's mind raced. Since when did getting your mail require permission from the police? She looked at her house, so close she could see the ceramic angels Robert had hung in the front window. The morning glory vines she had trained to grow up the porch columns swayed gently in the breeze. Everything about this place screamed home, yet these 2 men looked at her as if she were a criminal. "Officers, I understand you're doing your job," Betty said carefully, "but I assure you I live here. If you'll just let me walk to my front door, I can show you my identification and anything else you need to see." The taller officer shook his head. "Ma'am, we can't let you enter that house until we verify your identity. For all we know, you could be planning to break in. Break in? Betty felt a surge of indignation rise in her throat. But she swallowed it down. Getting angry wouldn't help her situation. She had lived through enough to know that sometimes you had to play the game, even when the rules seemed completely unfair. I have my house keys right here, she said, reaching into the pocket of her gardening apron. The familiar weight of her key ring reassured her. She had carried these same keys for 3 decades, each one worn smooth by countless uses. The second officer's hand moved to his radio. Ma'am, please keep your hands where we can see them. Don't reach into your pockets without asking permission first. Betty froze, her hand halfway to her apron pocket. The absurdity of the situation was almost overwhelming. Here she stood, in front of her own home, being treated like a threat by 2 police officers who clearly had no idea who she was, or how long she had been a part of this community. Around them, the neighborhood was beginning to wake up. She could see curtains twitching in windows across the street, and she noticed Mrs. Patterson from next door peering out from behind her front door. The morning that had started so peacefully in her garden now felt like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. Officers, Betty said slowly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent 40 years teaching high school students. I am an elderly woman standing in front of my own home, holding my own mail with my gardening tools visible on my porch. What exactly do you think I'm planning to do? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications none of them wanted to acknowledge directly. Betty could see something shift in the officers' expressions, but they didn't back down. If anything, their stance became more rigid, more defensive. The taller officer pulled out a small notebook. Ma'am, we're going to need your name and date of birth while we sort this out. Betty stared at the notebook in the officer's hand, feeling the weight of the moment settle around her like a heavy blanket. She had given her name and date of birth, watched as he wrote it down with the same mechanical precision she had seen countless times in her teaching career. But instead of resolving the situation, it seemed to make things worse. Betty Johnson, the taller officer repeated, flipping through his notebook as if her name might reveal some hidden criminal history. And you claim you live at this address? The word claim stung. After 30 years of mortgage payments, property taxes, and countless improvements to her home, she was now being asked to prove her right to exist in her own front yard. I don't claim anything, officer. I know I live here because I've been paying the bills for 3 decades. The shorter officer had moved closer to her house, examining it with the suspicious eye of someone looking for evidence of wrongdoing. He peered at her garden tools, her welcome mat, even the address numbers clearly displayed beside her front door. These could belong to anyone, he said, gesturing at her watering can and pruning shears. Doesn't prove you live here. Betty felt a laugh bubbling up in her throat, the kind of bitter amusement that comes when a situation becomes so absurd it defies logic. Officer, those are my roses I was tending when you arrived. I planted them with my late husband 20 years ago. The red ones are American beauties. The pink are tea roses, and those yellow climbers took me 3 years to train up that fence. Neither officer seemed impressed by her detailed knowledge of her own garden. The taller one clicked his pen and looked at his partner. We're going to need to verify this information before we can let you proceed. Let her proceed? Betty realized with growing alarm that what had started as a simple question was turning into something much more serious. She was being detained, held against her will in front of her own home by 2 men who seemed determined to see her as a threat rather than a neighbor. How exactly are you planning to verify that I live here? She asked, trying to keep her voice calm and reasonable. Would you like to call the utility company? The mortgage company? My neighbors can vouch for me. The shorter officer shook his head. Ma'am, we can't just take someone's word for it. We need official documentation. Do you have a driver's license or state ID with this address? Yes, I do. It's in my purse, which is inside my house. Betty gestured again toward her front door, but the officers made no move to allow her to retrieve it. We can't let you enter the residence until we confirm your identity, the taller officer said, as if reading from a script. For officer safety, Betty had heard those words before, usually on the evening news when someone who looked like her had been hurt or killed during what show. Old had been a routine encounter. The phrase sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the morning air. By now, more neighbors had emerged from their houses. Mrs. Patterson stood openly on her front porch, her phone in her hand. Across the street, a young couple had come out to walk their dog, but stopped to watch the unfolding drama. Betty could see others peering from windows, and she felt the familiar burn of humiliation that came with being the center of unwanted attention. "Look," Betty said, her patience beginning to fray. "I understand you have a job to do, but this is getting ridiculous. I am a 73-year-old woman who was watering her flowers. I have lived in this house since 1993. I taught at Roosevelt High School for 40 years. Half the people in this neighborhood have seen me in this yard every day for decades." The taller officer looked around at the gathering crowd, and Betty thought she saw a flicker of uncertainty cross his face, but instead of backing down, he seemed to double down on his authority. "Ma'am, we've received multiple reports about suspicious activity in this area. People have complained about individuals who don't belong here loitering around expensive homes. We're just doing our job to keep this neighborhood safe." The implication was clear, and it hit Betty like a slap. She didn't belong here. In their eyes, a woman who looked like her couldn't possibly be the rightful owner of a home in this neighborhood. She was the suspicious activity they had been called to investigate. "Multiple reports?" Betty asked, her voice rising slightly. "About what exactly? About me watering my roses? About me getting my mail? What exactly have I done that's suspicious?" The shorter officer stepped forward, his posture becoming more aggressive. "Ma'am, you need to calm down. Getting agitated isn't helping your situation." Betty felt something snap inside her chest. She had been calm. She had been polite. She had answered their questions and tried to cooperate, and yet she was being told to calm down as if she were the one being unreasonable. "My situation?" she repeated, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades commanding the attention of teenagers. "Officer, my situation is that I am standing in front of my own home, being interrogated for the crime of existing while black in my own neighborhood." The words hung in the air like smoke, making visible something everyone could see, but no one wanted to acknowledge. The taller officer's jaw tightened and his partner's hand moved instinctively toward his radio. "Ma'am, this has nothing to do with race," the taller officer said stiffly. "We're responding to legitimate concerns from residents about suspicious activity." Betty looked around at the faces watching from windows and porches. Some looked sympathetic, others curious, a few seemed uncomfortable with what they were witnessing. Mrs. Patterson had moved closer, her phone definitely recording now. "Whose concerns?" Betty asked. "Which neighbor called you about me? I'd like to know who thinks I'm suspicious so I can have a conversation with them about it." The officers exchanged another glance, and Betty realized they probably couldn't or wouldn't tell her who had made the complaint. For all she knew, no one had called at all. Maybe they had just seen her and decided she didn't look like she belonged. "We're not at liberty to reveal the identity of complainants," the shorter officer said, "but we are at liberty to investigate when we receive reports of potential criminal activity." Criminal activity. Betty felt the word hit her like a physical blow. She thought about all the times she had waved to patrol cars that drove down her street, all the years she had felt safe and protected in her community. Now she was being treated like the very criminals she had always trusted the police to protect her from. "What criminal activity?" she demanded. "Show me one thing I've done wrong. One law I've broken. One reason you have to keep me standing here like this." The taller officer flipped his notebook closed with a sharp snap. "Ma'am, you're being detained for investigation. We have reasonable suspicion that you may be trespassing on private property." Trespassing. On her own property. Betty felt the ground shift under her feet, as if the very earth she had called home for 30 years was no longer solid. She looked at her roses, still blooming despite the chaos around them, and wondered how something so beautiful could exist in a world so fundamentally unfair. The crowd of neighbors was growing larger now, and she could hear murmured conversations. People trying to make sense of what they were seeing. Some were taking pictures and videos with their phones. Betty realized that this moment, this humiliation, was being recorded and would probably end up on social media before the day was over. She thought about calling her son, but her phone was inside the house with her purse and her identification. Everything she needed to prove she belonged here was just a few feet away, but it might as well have been on the moon for all the good it did her now. The situation had reached a breaking point that Betty never could have imagined when she stepped outside to tend her roses that morning. What started as a simple question had escalated into a full investigation, complete with backup officers who had arrived in response to the taller officer's radio call. Now 3 patrol cars lined the street, their red and blue lights flashing silently, turning her quiet neighborhood into something that looked like a crime scene. Betty stood in the center of it all, still holding her mail, still wearing her gardening gloves, watching as more officers emerged from their vehicles. The new arrivals spoke in hushed tones with the original two, occasionally glancing in her direction as if she were a puzzle they were trying to solve. She caught fragments of their conversation, words like uncooperative and refuses to provide identification that made her feel like she was watching a movie about someone else's life. The crowd of neighbors had grown to nearly a dozen people, some standing boldly on the sidewalk, others hanging back on their porches but clearly invested in the outcome. Mrs. Patterson had been joined by her husband, and together they whispered urgently while maintaining their vigil. Betty noticed that several phones were pointed in her direction, recording everything for posterity or social media or whatever people did with videos of their neighbors being humiliated by police. "Ma'am," one of the newly arrived officers said, approaching her with a clipboard in his hand. "I'm Sergeant Williams. I understand there's been some confusion here about your residency status." Residency status. Betty almost laughed at the bureaucratic language being used to describe her standing in front of her own home. "There's no confusion on my part, Sergeant. I live here. I have lived here for 30 years. These officers seem to have decided I'm lying about that for reasons I can't understand." Sergeant Williams looked at the house, then back at her, his expression more neutral than the original officers but no less skeptical. "Do you have any documentation that proves you live at this address?" "Yes, I do. It's in my house, which these officers won't let me enter." Betty gestured toward her front door, feeling like she was trapped in an endless loop of the same conversation. "We can't allow you to enter the residence until we verify your identity," the sergeant explained, using the same words his subordinates had been repeating for the past 30 minutes. "It's a matter of officer safety and proper procedure." Betty felt something break inside her, a dam that had been holding back years of accumulated frustration and disappointment. "Officer safety?" she said, her voice rising. "I am a 73-year-old woman wearing gardening gloves and holding my mail. What exactly do you think I'm going to do to threaten your safety?" The sergeant held up a hand in what was probably meant to be a calming gesture. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to lower your voice. Getting agitated isn't going to help resolve this situation." There it was again. The suggestion that she was the problem, that her reaction to being treated like a criminal in her own yard was somehow inappropriate. Betty looked around at all the uniformed men surrounding her, at the flashing lights and gathering crowd, and wondered what kind of response would be considered appropriate in this situation. "How would you like me to react?" she asked, her voice tight with controlled anger. "How would you feel if you were standing in front of your own home, being treated like a trespasser by people who are supposed to protect and serve your community?" One of the original officers spoke up from behind the sergeant. "She's been uncooperative from the beginning, refuses to provide identification, keeps insisting she lives here without any proof." Betty turned to face him, feeling 30 years of teaching experience kick in. "Young man, I have not refused to provide identification. I have explained repeatedly that my identification is in my house, which you won't let me enter. There's a difference between refusing and being prevented." The distinction seemed lost on him, but she noticed a few of the neighbors nodding in agreement. Mrs. Patterson stepped forward, her phone still recording but her voice carrying across the yard. "Excuse me, officers," she called out. "Betty has lived there for decades. We can all vouch for her. This seems like a misunderstanding that could be cleared up pretty easily." The sergeant looked toward Mrs. Patterson with an expression that suggested civilian input was not welcome. "Ma'am, please step back. We're conducting an investigation here." "An investigation of what?" Mrs. Patterson shot back, her voice sharp with indignation. "Of a woman watering her own flowers?" Betty felt a surge of gratitude toward her neighbor, but also a growing sense of dread about where this was all heading. The officers were clearly committed to their course of action, and any challenge to their authority seemed only to make them dig in deeper. "Look," Betty said, trying one more time to appeal to reason. "I understand that you received some kind of report, but I'm standing here with my mail, in front of my house with my garden tools on my porch. My neighbors can identify me. The mailman who delivered this mail knows me. What more do you need?" The sergeant consulted his clipboard. "We need official documentation that proves you are the lawful resident of this property. A driver's license, lease agreement, deed, or utility bill with your name and this address." "All of which are in my house," Betty repeated. feeling like she was talking to children who couldn't grasp a simple concept. "Which we cannot allow you to access until we verify your identity," the sergeant replied, completing the perfect circle of bureaucratic impossibility. Betty looked at her watch and realized this had been going on for over an hour. An hour of her life spent proving she had the right to exist in her own front yard. An hour of humiliation in front of her neighbors and whoever else was watching the growing spectacle. She thought about her son, probably at his law office downtown, dealing with real criminals and actual legal problems. She had always been proud of how independent she was, how she never needed to rely on him for help with day-to-day problems. But this wasn't a day-to-day problem. This was something that required expertise she didn't have. "I want to call my son," she announced, the words coming out more firmly than she felt. The sergeant looked up from his clipboard. "Ma'am, you're not under arrest." "You don't have the right to a phone call." "I'm not asking for a right," Betty replied. "I'm asking for the basic human courtesy of being allowed to contact my family when I'm being detained for no reason." The word detained seemed to make several of the officers uncomfortable. They exchanged glances, and Betty realized they probably hadn't officially detained her, which meant they couldn't legally prevent her from leaving. But where could she go? This was her home, her property, and leaving would only make her look more suspicious. "Fine," the sergeant said finally. "You can make one call, but it has to be quick and it has to be on speaker so we can monitor the conversation." Betty felt a mix of relief and fresh humiliation. Even her phone call would be supervised, as if she might use it to coordinate some kind of criminal activity. She looked around at the neighbors still watching, at the police cars still flashing their lights, at her roses still blooming innocently in the background of this surreal scene. "My phone is in my house," she said quietly. The sergeant sighed and pulled out his own phone. "What's the number?" Betty recited her son's office number, the same one she had memorized when he first passed the bar exam 15 years ago. She listened as the sergeant dialed, watched as he held the phone up between them, and felt her heart racing as it began to ring. "Patterson, Rodriguez and Associates, this is Linda," came the familiar voice of the receptionist. "This is Sergeant Williams with the Metropolitan Police. I have someone here who wants to speak with—" He looked at Betty expectantly. "David Johnson," Betty said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tell him it's his mother, and I need him to come to the house right away." The 20 minutes that passed between Betty's phone call and her son's arrival felt like the longest 20 minutes of her life. She stood under the watchful eyes of 4 police officers, surrounded by neighbors and strangers who had stopped to gawk at the spectacle unfolding on quiet Maple Street. The morning sun had climbed higher, and she could feel sweat gathering under her gardening clothes, though she wasn't sure if it was from the heat or the stress of her situation. The officers had relaxed slightly after her phone call, but they maintained their positions around her yard like sentries guarding a prisoner. The sergeant had returned to his patrol car to make radio calls, leaving the original 2 officers to watch her, while the third wandered around her property, examining her garden tools and outdoor decorations as if they might reveal some hidden truth about her identity. Betty tried to stay calm by focusing on her roses, mentally cataloging which ones needed more attention, and planning the afternoon watering schedule she hoped she would be free to follow. But every few minutes, one of the officers would ask her another question, or make another comment that reminded her of the absurdity of her situation. Pretty expensive neighborhood for someone living on a teacher's pension, the shorter officer had muttered at one point, loud enough for her to hear but quiet enough that he could deny saying it if confronted. Mrs. Patterson had brought her a bottle of water, which the officers allowed after inspecting it as if it might contain contraband. Her neighbor's kindness touched Betty deeply, but it also highlighted how completely the normal order of her world had been turned upside down. She needed permission now to receive water from her own neighbor while standing in her own yard. The sound of a car engine made everyone turn toward the street. A silver Mercedes sedan pulled up behind the patrol cars, its sleek lines and polished surface standing out among the utilitarian police vehicles. The driver's door opened and David Johnson stepped out, his tall frame unfolding with the graceful confidence that came from 15 years of courtroom experience. Even from a distance, Betty could see the controlled fury in her son's movements. He wore a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than most people made in a month, and his leather briefcase swung at his side as he strode toward the group of officers. His face was a mask of professional composure, but Betty knew her son well enough to recognize the storm brewing behind his calm exterior. The officers noticed him too, their postures shifting slightly as they tried to assess this new player in their drama. The sergeant emerged from his patrol car, clipboard in hand, ready to deal with what he probably assumed was an angry family member who would need to be managed and controlled. "Excuse me, sir," the sergeant called out as David approached. "This is an active investigation. I'm going to need you to step back." David stopped about 10 feet away and reached into his jacket pocket, producing a leather wallet that he flipped open to reveal his bar association card and business identification. "I'm David Johnson, attorney at law. This is my mother, and I understand she's being detained without cause." The change in the officer's demeanor was immediate and unmistakable. The sergeant's clipboard suddenly seemed less important, and the two original officers exchanged glances that suggested they were beginning to realize they might have made a serious mistake. "Sir, we're not detaining anyone," the sergeant said, though his voice lacked the authority it had carried just moments before. "We're investigating a report of suspicious activity, and we're trying to verify this woman's identity and right to be on this property." David walked over to his mother, his eyes scanning her face with the practiced assessment of someone accustomed to evaluating clients who had been through traumatic experiences. "Mom, are you okay? Have they hurt you?" "I'm fine, honey," Betty said, though the relief in her voice was obvious to everyone within earshot. "Just tired of being treated like a criminal for watering my own roses." David nodded and turned back to the officers, his expression hardening. "Gentlemen, let me make sure I understand this situation correctly. You've detained my 73-year-old mother for over an hour because someone reported suspicious activity, and that suspicious activity was her gardening in front of the house she's owned for 30 years. The taller of the original officers stepped forward, apparently deciding to take charge of the conversation. "Sir, we received a complaint about someone who didn't belong in this neighborhood. We're just doing our job to investigate and ensure community safety." "Someone who didn't belong," David repeated, his voice taking on the sharp edge that Betty recognized from the few times she had watched him in court. "Based on what criteria exactly? What did my mother do that suggested she didn't belong here?" The officer's answer came too quickly, as if he had been preparing for this question. "She was unable to provide identification proving her residency." David's eyebrows rose slightly, a gesture that Betty knew meant he was about to destroy someone's argument. "She was unable to provide identification because you wouldn't allow her to enter her own house to retrieve it. Is that correct?" "We couldn't allow her to enter the residence until we verified her identity," the sergeant interjected, falling back on the same circular logic they had been using all morning. "And how exactly were you planning to verify her identity without allowing her access to her identification?" David asked, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer would be inadequate. The officers looked at each other, and Betty could see them beginning to realize the legal and logical holes in their position. But instead of backing down, they seemed to double down on their authority. "Sir, we have procedures we have to follow," the shorter officer said. "When we receive a complaint about suspicious activity, we have to investigate thoroughly." David pulled out his phone and began recording, holding it up so T.O. had all the officers were clearly visible. "Please state for the record what specific crime you suspected my mother of committing." "We weren't investigating a specific crime," the sergeant said, clearly uncomfortable with being recorded. "We were investigating a complaint." "A complaint about what, specifically?" David pressed. "What was the nature of the suspicious activity that was reported?" The officers exchanged glances again, and Betty realized they were probably beginning to understand that they couldn't articulate a legitimate reason for their actions. The complaint, whatever it was, had been vague enough that they had filled in the blanks with their own assumptions about who belonged in this neighborhood and who didn't. "Sir, we're not required to discuss the details of ongoing investigations with civilians," the taller officer said, though he sounded less confident than he had an hour ago. David's smile was sharp and cold. "Officer, I'm not a civilian in this context. I'm an attorney representing a client who has been unlawfully detained by police officers who cannot articulate a legitimate reason for their actions. And everything you've said and done here has been recorded by multiple witnesses." He gestured toward the neighbors, many of whom were still filming with their phones. Mrs. Patterson gave him a small wave, her own phone held steady in her hand. Now, David continued, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to commanding courtrooms, I'm going to ask you one more time. What specific articulable facts led you to believe my mother was engaged in criminal activity? The silence that followed was deafening. Betty watched as her son faced down 4 police officers with nothing but the power of logic and legal training, and she felt a pride that had nothing to do with his expensive suit or luxury car. This was her boy, the one she had raised to stand up for what was right, using his education and position to protect not just her, but the principle that no one should be treated the way she had been treated. The sergeant cleared his throat and looked down at his clipboard, as if the answer might be written there. Sir, we were responding to a legitimate complaint from a concerned citizen. We're just trying to keep the neighborhood safe. Safe from what? David asked. From elderly women gardening? From longtime residents collecting their mail? I need you to be very specific about what threat my mother posed that justified over an hour of detention and interrogation. The confrontation between David and the officers had drawn an even larger crowd. People from neighboring streets had wandered over to see what was happening, and the scene had taken on the atmosphere of a public hearing rather than a police investigation. Betty watched her son methodically dismantle the officers' justifications, his questions becoming more pointed with each exchange. Let me ask you something else, David said, pocketing his phone but keeping his recording app running. Have you run my mother's name through your system to check for outstanding warrants or criminal history? The sergeant nodded. We did a standard background check. No criminal history, no outstanding warrants. So you knew within minutes of getting her name that she had no criminal background, yet you continued to detain her for another hour. Why? The question hung in the air like smoke, visible to everyone but impossible to clear away. Betty could see the officers struggling with an answer that wouldn't expose the real reason for their persistence. We still needed to verify her residency, the taller officer said weakly. David walked over to his mother's mailbox and pulled out a piece of mail she had dropped during the initial confrontation. This is a utility bill addressed to Betty Johnson at 1247 Maple Street. The same name you ran through your system, the same address where you found her. She was holding this mail when you first approached her. What additional verification did you need? He held up the envelope so everyone could see the address label clearly printed in black ink. Several neighbors nodded in recognition, and Betty heard someone in the crowd mutter about how obvious it should have been. The shorter officer shifted uncomfortably. Anyone could have someone else's mail, could they? David asked, his eyebrows rising. Are you suggesting my mother stole mail from this address, then came here to... What exactly? Water stolen roses? 10 to stolen garden tools? Please walk me through your theory of what crime was being committed here. Betty watched the officers' faces as they realized how ridiculous their position had become. They had started with a complaint about suspicious activity, and had somehow turned it into an investigation of possible mail theft, trespassing, and identity fraud, all because a black woman was gardening in an affluent neighborhood. Furthermore, David continued, pulling a business card from his wallet, I'd like to know who made the original complaint. As my mother's attorney, I have the right to know what specific allegations were made against her. The sergeant shook his head. We can't reveal the identity of complainants. It's department policy. I'm not asking for a name, David replied smoothly. I'm asking for the specific nature of the complaint. What exactly did the caller report seeing that they considered suspicious? The officers exchanged looks again, and Betty realized they probably didn't have a good answer to that question either. The complaint had likely been vague, possibly nothing more than someone who doesn't belong here, and the officers had filled in the details based on their own assumptions. Sir, we're not required to share the details of our investigation, the sergeant said, falling back on procedure when logic failed him. David smiled, and Betty recognized the expression. It was the same look he had worn as a child when he had caught his sister in a lie and was about to prove it. Actually, you are required to have reasonable, articulable suspicion of criminal activity to detain someone. And since you can't articulate what that suspicion was based on, this detention has been unlawful from the beginning. He pulled out his phone again, this time scrolling through his contacts. I'm going to call your supervisor and the department's internal affairs division. I'm also going to file a formal complaint about this incident, and I want all of your badge numbers and names for my report. The change in the officers was immediate. The sergeant stepped forward, his tone becoming conciliatory for the first time since David's arrival. "Sir, I think there's been a misunderstanding here. We were just trying to be thorough in our investigation." "No misunderstanding," David replied firmly. "You detained my mother for over an hour without cause, refused to allow her access to her own property, and treated her like a criminal for the act of gardening while black. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a civil rights violation." Betty felt tears prick at her eyes, not from sadness but from the overwhelming relief of finally having someone articulate what had been done to her. For over an hour, she had been made to feel like she was crazy for thinking she was being treated unfairly. Now her son was putting words to the injustice, naming it for what it was. Mrs. Patterson stepped forward from the crowd, her phone still recording. "Officers, I've lived next door to Betty for 28 years. I've watched her tend that garden, collect that mail, and care for this property longer than some of you have been alive. What happened here today was wrong and everyone knows it." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd of neighbors. Others began speaking up, sharing their own observations about Betty's long residence in the neighborhood, her contributions to the community, and their shock at how she had been treated. The sergeant looked around at the hostile crowd and seemed to realize that his department's public relations nightmare was only getting worse. "Ma'am," he said to Betty, "we apologize for any inconvenience. You're free to go about your business." Betty felt a surge of anger at the casual dismissal. "Inconvenience?" she repeated. "Officer, this wasn't an inconvenience. This was an hour and a half of humiliation in front of my neighbors because someone decided I didn't look like I belonged in my own yard." David put a protective arm around his mother's shoulders. "Don't apologize to us," he said to the sergeant. "Apologize to your department, because they're going to be dealing with the fallout from this for months. And apologize to this community, because you've damaged the trust between police and residents that takes years to build." The officers began moving toward their patrol cars, clearly eager to leave the scene. But David wasn't finished with them yet. "One more thing," he called out. "I want the incident report number for this investigation, and I want copies of all body camera footage from today's encounter." The sergeant paused at his car door. "Sir, you'll need to file a public records request for that information." "Consider it filed," David replied. "And consider this your notice that my firm will be representing my mother in any legal action that results from this incident." As the patrol cars finally pulled away, their lights no longer flashing, the crowd of neighbors began to disperse, but many stopped to speak with Betty, offering support and expressing their outrage at what they had witnessed. Mrs. Patterson hugged her tightly, and Mr. Chen from across the street shook David's hand and thanked him for standing up to the officers. Betty looked at her roses, still blooming despite the chaos that had surrounded them, and felt a complex mix of emotions: relief that the ordeal was over, gratitude for her son's protection, and sadness that such protection had been necessary, but also a quiet determination that what had happened to her wouldn't happen to someone else if she could help it. "Mom," David said softly, "let's get you inside. You've been through enough for one day." Betty nodded, but as they walked toward her front door, she stopped and looked back at her garden. Tomorrow she would be out here again, tending her roses and collecting her mail, because this was her home and no one had the right to make her feel otherwise. The officers were gone, but the flowers remained, rooted in soil she had nurtured for 30 years. "David," she said as they reached her front steps, "I want to make sure this story gets told. Not just for me, but for everyone who doesn't have a lawyer son to call when the police decide they don't belong in their own neighborhood." David squeezed her hand gently. "We'll make sure it gets told, Mom. And we'll make sure it matters." As they walked into the house together, Betty felt the weight of the morning settling on her shoulders. But she also felt something else, the knowledge that she hadn't faced this alone, and that sometimes justice came not from the system working as it should, but from people who refused to accept injustice when they saw it.